For 41 years on this rock, I learned one thing with absolute certainty. The sea only gives back what it no longer needs. Wreckage, nets, shattered barrels, and the dead. Bloated, silent, with faces that no longer belong to anyone. I buried them in the cleft behind the northern slope, spoke words over them that no one in heaven seemed to hear, and went back to my lamp. That was always how it was. The sea gave me its dead, and I gave them rest. It was a fair exchange, and I believed it would never change until my own end came. But on the night the storm tore the sky to pieces, the sea gave me something it had never given me in all my years of service. It gave me someone alive. And I swear to you, whoever you are, listening or reading this now, it would have been better if it had brought me one more corpse. I'll start from the very beginning, because otherwise you won't understand how an old man like me could end up at the center of everything that happened next. The lighthouse stood on a bare rock 3 hours from the nearest shore in good weather, and an eternity away in bad. The rock jutted from the water like a broken tooth, ringed by reefs that had claimed so many ships over the centuries that the local fishermen called these waters a graveyard without crosses. My lighthouse was the only cross over that entire graveyard. A tall white tower, long since turned grey from salt and wind, the keeper's house clinging to its base, a fuel shed, a rainwater cistern, and a tiny cove where I kept my boat. That was my whole world. Every few weeks, a supply boat would come with provisions and mail that I had no one to write to, then leave again, returning me to the sea and the light. I chose this solitude myself. I won't lie and say I was exiled here, or that fate drove me to this place against my will. I came of my own accord, the way a man enters a monastery, to hide from something that won't let go. I had a different life once. A home that smelled of bread and someone else's hair on the pillow beside me. Laughter in the rooms, and then water took all of it. Different water, in a different place, but just as indifferent as the water now beating against my rock. I failed to protect the people I was supposed to protect. When it was all over, I knew I couldn't go on living among people who looked at me with pity. And so I became a keeper. A man whose only job was to make sure the light didn't go out and that others didn't repeat my fate. There was a bitter justice in that, and I held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto a plank. By the time I was old, I had grown so accustomed to my routine that I could carry it out with my eyes closed. Up before dawn, check the wick and the mechanism, wind the clockwork that turned the lenses, log entries, weather, visibility, passing vessels. A meager meal. Long hours at the window with a pipe I hadn't packed in years, just holding it in my teeth out of habit. And then the light again, the light, all through the night, until the grey dawn allowed me to extinguish the lamp. I talked to myself because there was no one else, and sometimes it seemed to me that the tower answered back with a creaking of its old bones. That night began like hundreds of other stormy nights, only angrier. The barometer had been falling all day, as though some invisible hand was pressing down on it. By evening, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the sea swelled and went black. I battened down everything that could be battened down, checked the stores, lit the lamp early, and climbed up to the lantern room to stay close to it. The storm hit with a darkness. The wind howled so loudly it drowned out my own thoughts. The rain didn't fall from above, but came in sideways, flat and hard, as though the sea had decided to rise into the sky and crash down on my rock from there. The tower shook. The lantern glass rang. I watched the waves climb the rock higher than I had ever seen them in my memory, licking away stones that had lain there, I imagined, since the beginning of the world. And then, in the very heart of that madness, I saw a light that had no business being there. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. A brief flash below, right at the reefs, where there could be nothing but water and death. Then another. Not a reflection of my lamp, a different light, faint, frantic, fading. A signal. Someone out there in that hell was still clinging to life and calling for help. Something happened in my chest that hadn't happened in many years. My heart lurched. Somewhere out there was a vessel, or what remained of one, and on it was a living person. I knew that going outside was madness. Anyone who showed themselves on the rock in a storm like this would be torn away by the wind and flung into the water in an instant. My reason screamed at me to stay by the lamp, to do my job, to keep the light burning. That was all I could give, all that was asked of me. But there was something else in me, that old unhealed thing that had once been too late to save. And it got me to my feet before reason could win the argument. I pulled on my storm gear, tied a rope around myself, secured the other end to the iron ring set into the wall by the door, and stepped out into the roaring dark. The wind hit me so hard I nearly went down. Salt burned my eyes, rain lashed my face, and every step across the wet, slick rock could have been my last. I made my way down toward the lower rocks, toward the side where I'd seen the light, the rope pulling taut behind me like the only thread still connecting me to life. Below, in the gaps between the waves, I made him out. A man. The surf was throwing him against the rocks like a rag doll, washing over him and hurling him back, and he was barely moving, his white fingers hooked around a ledge of rock. I don't remember exactly how I reached him. I only remember that at some point my hand closed around his wrist, and I pulled and pulled with everything my old body still had, bracing my feet, cursing the sea, cursing the wind, cursing my own weakness. A wave buried us both, and I was certain it was over, that we were both about to be swept into the black deep. But the rope held, and I held. I dragged him up onto a ledge, hauled him over my shoulder, and crawled back up toward the door, toward the light, toward the warmth, feeling his limp body pressing down on my back like a dead weight that I prayed was still breathing. When I finally pulled him inside and kicked the door shut, cutting off the roar of the storm, a deafening silence settled over the house. The man lay on my kitchen floor in a spreading pool of seawater and didn't move. I dropped to my knees beside him, shaking with cold and exhaustion, and pressed my ear to his chest. His heart was beating, faintly, unevenly, but beating. He was alive. I had saved him. I stripped off his wet clothes, rubbed him down with a rough towel, wrapped him in every blanket in the house, and pulled him closer to the stove. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. A powerfully built man in his prime, with a face that even in unconsciousness held a kind of hard, focused tension. On his body I noticed old scars, of a kind you don't see on fishermen or sailors. Thin, clean, as if from a blade. But I didn't give it much thought at the time. At the time I was thinking only that I had taken the sea's prize away from it. That for once in my life I had been in time. It was only when I was covering him that I noticed his right hand. It was clenched in a fist so tight the knuckles had gone white. Even unconscious, on the edge of death, frozen to the bone, this man was holding onto something and would not let go. I tried to gently pry his fingers open. It seemed to me there was something unnatural about a grip like that, and that he might breathe more easily if he relaxed. But his fingers wouldn't give. They held their burden with a stubbornness that goes deeper than consciousness, deeper than life. The way you only hold onto something worth more than life itself. I could just make out the edge of something metallic, glinting faintly between his fingers. A small key, or a tag. Something small and clearly infinitely important. I sat beside him all night, feeding the fire, listening to the storm slowly exhaust itself beyond the walls, and watching that clenched fist. And for the first time in 41 years, my solitude felt not like a prison, but like a fortress. A fortress I had just opened with my own hands to let in something I didn't understand at all. Toward morning, when the wind had died down and grey light was beginning to seep through the windows, the stranger suddenly stirred. His eyelids fluttered, his lips moved, and I leaned closer to catch the first words of the man I had pulled from the jaws of death. I was expecting gratitude. I was expecting him to ask where he was and what had happened. I was waiting for something human. But he whispered something else entirely. Barely audible, without opening his eyes, he asked whether they were already on their way. And that question, spoken by a man who should have been grateful to be alive, settled over my heart colder than all the water of that storm. I understood that what I'd pulled from the sea was more than just a man. I'd pulled out someone's shadow. And that shadow hadn't come alone. The first thing the survivor asked when he finally came to his senses properly wasn't where he was or what had happened to him. He opened his eyes, swept his gaze around my kitchen, quickly, sharply, the way an animal sizes up a cage, and asked whether I lived alone on this rock and whether there was any way to reach the mainland. Only then, as if catching himself, did he add a few words of thanks in a weak voice, words that sounded as though he'd read them somewhere and was now reciting them from memory. I told him yes, I was alone here, that the supply boat came rarely, and that my only means of communication was an old radio that played up in bad weather. I watched his face as I said it. It showed neither disappointment nor relief, only a quick, cold calculation that immediately hid itself behind a mask of a tired smile. This man, barely back from the brink of death, was already weighing things up and working out his options. And I, who had spent my whole life among plain people whose faces were open as books, understood that the man before me was a book written in a language I didn't know. I poured him something hot to drink and helped him sit up, propping him with pillows. He drank greedily with both hands, and I noticed that his left hand held the mug while his right remained clenched in a fist, hidden under the blanket. Whatever he'd been holding through the night, he hadn't let go of it now either. I asked his name. He paused, a fraction of a second, one I'd never have caught if I hadn't spent the whole night watching his clenched fist and turning his strange words over in my mind. That pause held the work of thought, a choice. Then he gave a name, a simple, ordinary name, the kind thousands of people carry. I nodded and gave mine. That is, I introduced myself as the Keeper, because my real name was one I hadn't spoken aloud in so long that it had grown foreign to me. He didn't ask what I was actually called. It didn't interest him. Something else did. What happened to the vessel? I asked. Was there a wreck? Were there other survivors? Did I need to go out onto the rocks and search? At the word wreck, something flickered in his eyes. He told me a story, smooth, well-shaped, with just enough detail to sound convincing and not a word more. He'd been traveling as a passenger on a small vessel. A storm had blown up. The vessel had struck the reefs. He'd ended up in the water. He hadn't seen the others. They were most likely all dead. He told it in a level voice, looking me straight in the eye, and it would all have been persuasive enough if I hadn't pulled him out with my own hands and seen what he'd been wearing. Because a man traveling as an ordinary passenger doesn't wear, beneath torn outer clothing, the things I'd taken off him. I know nothing about luxury. There's no place for it on my rock. But even I understood that the watch I'd removed from his wrist and set out to dry on the shelf was worth more than my entire lighthouse and everything in it. Fine craftsmanship, heavy precious metal, and those scars. Neat, thin lines on his side and shoulder, the kind left not by rock or reef, but only by a deliberate human hand holding something sharp. I said nothing about any of it. I nodded and listened, topped up his drink and fed the fire, playing the part of the simple-minded old man he apparently took me for. Let him, I thought. On my rock, simplicity is sometimes worth more than cunning. While he rested, I went about my chores, but now every move I made around the house, I made with him in mind. I showed him, without making a point of it, how my world was arranged. Let him see there was nowhere to run from here. I mentioned in passing that I had supplies for many weeks ahead, that there was fresh water, that the boat wouldn't be coming for a good while, and that my dinghy was the only one here, and in this weather couldn't carry even an experienced sailor to safety, let alone a man who'd nearly drowned. I said all this calmly, the way you talk about the weather. But what I was really doing was drawing the boundaries of the cage we now shared. The rock, the tower, the sea on every side, and not a living soul within many hours' reach. He listened carefully, too carefully for a man who should have found all this reassuring. A rescued fisherman would have been glad of the food, the warmth, the roof over his head. This one seemed to be drawing a map in his mind, marking exits and dead ends. When I mentioned the radio, he asked if he could have a look at it. Out of curiosity, he said. He knew a bit about equipment and might be able to help fix it. I told him it was up in the lamp room and that I'd see to it myself once the interference settled. In fact, the radio was in my room, and I'd already decided I wouldn't let him near it until I understood who he was and what he was running from. The day passed in this strange dance of courtesy and mistrust. He recovered with surprising speed. By evening, he was already on his feet, moving through the house with one hand trailing along the walls, his gaze returning again and again to the windows that faced the sea. He watched the horizon the way a man watches when he's waiting not for rescue, but for danger. Several times I caught him going still and listening, though there was nothing to hear but the dying surf and the cry of the gulls that had returned after the storm. I made a simple supper, and we ate in silence across from each other by the light of a single lamp. He held his spoon in his left hand, his right remained clenched, or rested in the pocket of the clothes I'd given him, my old clothes, hanging off him like a sack. I thought he must have moved his treasure there. Whatever it was, he hadn't parted with it for a moment. It grew dark, and I got up to light the lamp. He offered to help, but I declined, gently, saying the mechanism was temperamental and didn't take well to unfamiliar hands. The truth was, I didn't want him to know the layout of the tower any better than he already did. While I was winding the clockwork and checking the wick, I could hear him moving around below. His footsteps were quiet and careful, not the steps of a man recovering, shuffling from chair to chair, but the steps of someone taking stock, searching for something, or memorizing the arrangement of the rooms. I settled him for the night in the small room that had once served as a storeroom, and made up my own bed in the main room, by the stove, close to the staircase leading up, and to the chest where the radio lay beneath a pile of old charts. I lay awake for a long time, listening. The house fell quiet, the sea calmed, and in that silence I waited. I couldn't have said for what, but every old instinct I had told me the night wasn't over yet. I wasn't wrong. Deep in the small hours, when a truly exhausted man would have been sleeping soundly, I heard the door of his little room creak softly. Then came barely audible, creeping footsteps on the floorboards I knew by heart. Knew which ones groaned and where, and so I could hear him stepping between them, avoiding the ones that would give him away. That's not how a guest moves in the house of the man who saved him. That's how a thief moves, or a scout. I lay still, breathing slowly and deeply, feigning deep sleep, and watched through half-closed eyes as a dark figure moved through my room. He went to the shelves. Quietly, one by one, he went through my things, jars, tools, old books. He was looking for something specific and clearly hadn't found it because he moved on to the table, to the drawers. I understood he was looking for the radio. And perhaps not only that. Perhaps he was looking for something he could use to defend himself or to attack. I could have called out to him. Could have asked what he was doing in my room in the middle of the night. But I said nothing, because in that moment I made up my mind firmly. I would play his game, staying in the shadows until I understood its rules. He thought me a simple-minded old man who'd pulled him from the water out of the goodness of his heart and was now sleeping the sleep of the righteous. Let him think so. That ignorance was, for now, my only weapon. I lay there and watched a stranger search my home, and I thought about how, come morning, when he put his mask of a grateful guest back on, I would already know a little more about him than he realized. And I thought about his first words, whispered on the edge of death, whether they were already on their way. Whoever they were, I had no doubt now that they were real, and that sooner or later the sea that had once delivered this man to me would deliver his pursuers as well. At dawn, the sea laid out the remnants of its night's work across my rocks, and among them was something that turned my suspicions into certainty once and for all. I went out on my usual round, as I did after every storm, to gather whatever was useful and bury whatever was dead. And there, among the shattered planks, tangled rigging, and splinters that had once been someone's vessel, I found it. A locked metal box, solid, its corners banded with the same fine metal as my guest's watch, half buried in the shingle at the far end of the cove. It was heavy, very heavy for its size, and when I tried to open it, it wouldn't give. No keyhole on the outside, no visible hinges, only a smooth surface with one small recess of a complex shape. A recess that, I understood in the same instant, matched the shape of the object my guest had been clutching in his fist on that first night. I stood over that box while the cold morning sun lit my find, and something inside me went colder than any morning wind could manage. I understood that I hadn't pulled a shipwreck survivor out of the water. I'd pulled out a man who had been carrying something away. Something valuable enough that he'd kept the key to it even while unconscious, on the edge of death. And the wreck, my old mind told me, a mind that had seen more than its share of these graveyard waters, had been no accident. The ship hadn't simply run onto the reefs. Something had been done to it. I could have hidden the find. Some instinct told me to bury the box back in the shingle and say nothing. But another instinct, older and more stubborn, told me to look the man in the eye. So I lifted the box, barely managing its weight, and carried it toward the house, openly in plain sight. My guest was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching me come up the path. I saw the exact moment he made out what I was carrying. His face, which had been holding its mask of weary courtesy, came apart for one single instant. The mask fell away, and beneath it I saw everything at once: fear, fury, calculation, and something else that was worst of all, a kind of desperate resolve, the look of a cornered creature. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Then he smiled again, but I'd already seen what lay beneath the smile, and he knew that I had. From that moment on, the pretense between us was thinner than tissue paper, and we both knew it. I set the box on the kitchen table between us and sat down across from him. I said nothing for a while, filling my empty pipe out of habit. Then I said it plainly. I pulled you out of the water and asked you nothing. But now there's something on my table that someone's going to come looking for, or so it seems to me. And before they do, I want to know what I've let into my house. He was quiet for a long time as well. He looked at the box, then at me, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, choosing which version of the truth to feed me. And then he began to speak, and this time there was no smooth invention in his words. There was something closer to the truth, a polished half-truth, in which the lie lay not in the facts, but in what he left out about himself. He said he'd been a witness, that he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had seen something he was never meant to see, something that certain powerful people wanted kept secret at any cost. That the box contained proof, the only proof capable of exposing that secret and bringing those people down. That he'd fled with that proof, that the vessel he'd been sailing on had been betrayed and deliberately sunk so that both he and the box would vanish into the sea without a trace. And that he was the only one who had survived, because at the last moment the water had thrown him not into the deep, but onto my rock. I listened and didn't know what to believe. It was a fine story. In it, he was a hero, a fighter, a keeper of truth. But I looked at his neat, blade-made scars, at the hands that had moved with such practiced confidence through my house the night before, searching for a weapon, at that cold calculation I'd caught a glimpse of. And I thought that this fine story had another side he wasn't showing me. Perhaps he had been a witness. But witnesses don't carry scars like those, and they don't move through the dark the way he had. I was beginning to suspect that my guest had stood far closer to this secret than he wanted to let on. That he might not have been some ordinary man who'd stumbled onto someone else's affair, but one of the people who had created that secret and had simply decided at some point to turn it against his own. Who are these people? I asked. How will they know to look here, on a god-forsaken rock in the middle of these graveyard waters? He looked at me and said something that made me go cold inside all over again. They'll know, he answered, because they always know. They have eyes and ears everywhere. They trace the wreckage, check every scrap of land where a body and a box might have washed ashore. It's only a matter of time. And when they come, he added quietly, they won't leave any witnesses, none at all. He looked me straight in the eye, and I understood that he wasn't only talking about himself. He was talking about me. I, who had pulled him from the water, who had seen his face and his box, was now a witness too. And by the rules of those people, whoever they were, I was also to be eliminated. We both fell silent, and in the quiet I could hear the salvaged watch ticking on the shelf, the only sound in the house, counting out the time that, I now understood, was running shorter for us by the hour. All day I went about my work, turning over what I'd heard, unable to settle the one question that mattered. Which of the two was more dangerous to me? Those who might be coming across the sea, or the one already sitting in my house? I began to notice new things. The way he would, thinking I wasn't watching, test the weight of my axe by the woodpile. The way he stood at the window, studying my boat in the cove, the path down to it, the tide. The way he questioned me, as if out of idle curiosity, about how far the shipping lanes ran from here and how often I saw strange lights out at sea. He was preparing. I just didn't know for what exactly. Escape, defense, or getting rid of an inconvenient witness the moment he no longer needed one. Toward evening, I climbed up to the lamp room to ready the light for the night, and out of habit swept the horizon with my old spyglass. The sea after the storm was smooth and empty as glass, all the way to the edge where the sky met the water. I moved the glass along the horizon slowly, the way I always did, and was about to lower it when my eye caught a tiny point to the northeast. I went still. I wiped the lens and looked again. The point was not wreckage and not a trick of the light. It was a vessel. Dark, low, running without lights even as the dusk thickened. A vessel that didn't want to be seen. And it wasn't moving along the horizon the way ships do when they are passing my rock on their own course. It was moving straight toward the lighthouse. I lowered the glass slowly. Below, in the warm-lit house, sat a man with a dangerous secret locked in a box, the key to which he'd been clutching in his fist even as he was dying. And across the dark glass sea, without lights, silent and inevitable, came the people he'd spoken of. the ones who leave no witnesses. And I, an old keeper who had spent 40 years in self-imposed exile to hide from other people's deaths, understood that death had found me on its own. It was coming to me across the water, and my one lamp, which I would light in a few minutes as my duty required, would now guide it straight to my door. The dark vessel anchored at the outer edge of the reefs, beyond the reach of any beam from my lighthouse, and came no closer. It simply sat there, a black shape on black water, barely visible by starlight, and waited. And that waiting was more frightening than any assault. A man who attacks is at least something you can understand, but one who stands in the dark watching you flutter about your lit room like a moth in a jar already holds you in his palm before he closes his fingers. They knew we were here, they knew we had nowhere to run, and they were in no hurry. I came down from the lamp room and told my guest about the vessel. He wasn't surprised. He only walked to the window, stared into the darkness for a long moment, and then said quietly, almost calmly, "So they've come." There was no panic in his voice, only the exhaustion of a man who had been running for too long and had finally seen his pursuers close the distance. And beneath that exhaustion was the cold, focused clarity I'd already learned to recognize in him. He had no intention of giving up. Then he turned to face me and did what I'd been waiting for and dreading. He offered me a deal. He said the crate contained not only evidence of someone else's crime, but something else as well. Something that would keep a man comfortable for the rest of his days. He said that if we got out of here together, he wouldn't forget the man who'd saved him, that he'd make me rich, that I could leave this cursed rock and live out my years in warmth and ease anywhere on earth I chose. All I had to do, he said, was help him hold on and get away. Trust him. Be on his side. I listened, and I understood that this was the most dangerous moment of all the ones that had come before. Because a man who offers you wealth in exchange for your trust isn't buying your help. He's buying your back, which will be easier to put a knife in later. I could see straight through the deal. He needed me now, while the enemy stood at the door. But once that enemy was defeated or outmaneuvered, I'd stop being an ally and become the last witness. All his eloquence, all his promises of riches were nothing but a leash, one he meant to keep on me until the moment I became a liability. But I gave nothing away. I nodded, I frowned. I played the part of a man weighing temptation against fear, letting him think the promise of wealth was doing battle with my better judgment. I played the guileless old man dazzled by promises. Let him think he'd bought me. As long as he believed I was bought and foolish, he wouldn't see me as a threat. And I needed time. Time to understand the lay of the land, to find a way to survive both the ones outside and the one within. And so a game began between us. One I hadn't chosen, but was now in up to my neck. A game of trust, where each of us pretended to be the other's ally, and each of us knew the other was pretending. We were like two players at a table, where the stakes were life itself. Both hiding their cards, both smiling, both waiting to see who would be the first to lay something down that changed everything. I began to probe him carefully, learning the rules. Under the cover of a frightened old man's anxious questions, I worked out how many men might be on that vessel, how they were armed, what they were waiting for. He answered, sometimes with the truth, sometimes with half of it. And I'd already learned to read the shades of his lying by whether he looked away or, on the contrary, held my gaze a little too steadily. What his words added up to was a grim picture. There were several of them on the vessel. They weren't sailors. They were men of a particular trade, a trade whose chief skill was making other people permanently silent. They were waiting, most likely, for either dawn or the right moment or reinforcements. Or perhaps they simply wanted us to spend the night consuming ourselves with dread, so that by the time they arrived, we'd already be half broken. That night I wouldn't have lit the lamp if I could have helped it. But to darken the lighthouse meant breaking the only law I'd served my whole life. And, more to the point, it meant telling the man on that vessel that we'd spotted them and were afraid. So the light burned as it always had, turning steadily, throwing its beams out into the dark. And every time the beam swept over the black silhouette by the reefs, I had the feeling I could hear someone out there in the darkness smiling to themselves. Deep in the night, I went up to check the lamp and decided to stop by the radio on my way. To try, in spite of everything, to get word to the mainland that the lighthouse was in trouble. I went to the cabinet where I kept it under the old charts, moved the charts aside and stopped cold. The radio was there, but the cable connecting it to the antenna on the tower had been cut, cleanly, neatly, in a single stroke of a sharp blade. I stood looking at those two severed ends, and everything fell into place. The night before, he hadn't been searching my room for a weapon. He'd been looking for the radio. And when he couldn't take it with him, he'd done something worse. He'd taken away my voice. He'd taken away both our chances of calling for help. He didn't want anyone else to come. He needed isolation. The same isolation the man on the vessel needed. In that desire to cut us off from the world, my guest and our enemies were, strangely enough, of one mind. I didn't tell him I'd found the severed cable. I laid the charts carefully back in place and went upstairs with a face as still as water on a windless day. If he wanted to play in the dark, I was ready to play in the dark too. But now I knew one more important thing about him. He'd cut off the roots not only for his enemies, but for me as well. He had no intention of sharing anything with anyone, not the secret, and not me as a witness. Whatever happened next, there was no room in his plans for a living lighthouse keeper. That same night, I began to prepare. Quietly, without drawing attention, going about my ordinary business, I moved the things I needed most to new hiding places. The old knife I kept for household work made its way from the desk drawer to a spot I knew and he didn't, a concealed gap beneath the floorboard by the stairs. I checked every bolt, every shutter, and went over in my mind every passage and corner of my tower. The narrow spiral stairs, the heavy door to the lamp room that locked from the inside, the hatch in the floor leading down to the lower storeroom that my guest had no idea existed. 41 years this tower had been my home. I knew it the way you know your own body, every bone, every sinew. And if I was going to play a deadly game within these walls, then these walls were on my side. I'd nearly finished my quiet preparations and was standing by the lower door, listening to the night when it happened. Through the sound of the surf, through the steady hum of the lamp mechanism above, I heard a sound that hadn't come to my rock in many years and that I'd been dreading more than any other. A dull, heavy blow against the door, then another. Someone was standing outside in the night, right on the threshold of my home. Someone who just minutes before should have been on that black vessel by the reefs, a good hour's travel by water. They'd come ashore without a sound, under cover of darkness and the noise of the sea, slipping between the sweeps of the lighthouse beam, and now they were knocking at my door. I went still. Behind me on the stairs, a dark shape appeared, my guest. He'd heard it too. We looked at each other in the half-dark, two players whose game had just been interrupted by a third sitting down at the table. The door took another blow, and through the thick planks came a voice, calm, polite, monstrously calm for that hour and that place. The voice called for the keeper, using the very word I used for myself, as though they knew everything about me. The voice said they'd been in distress, that they needed help, that I had to open up. And I, standing in the darkness of my own home, between a locked door and a man with a dangerous secret at my back, understood that the game had truly begun now. The voice on the other side of the door called itself a rescuer, a shipwrecked sailor begging to be let in and warmed, and everything about that voice was right, measured, convincing, except for one single detail that gave it away entirely. A man whose vessel has broken apart on the reefs on a cold night, who has just been fighting the sea for his life, doesn't speak in a level, unhurried, almost lazy voice. There's no tremor in a voice like that, no ragged breathing, none of that horse-driven panic I'd heard from the real survivors I'd pulled onto this rock over the years. The voice at my door was dry and easy, like a man who just stepped out of a warm room. They hadn't been in distress. They'd come for us. And they were checking whether I'd open willingly to save themselves the trouble of dealing with a door they didn't yet know was solid, though I did. I didn't answer. I stood in the dark without breathing and signaled to the guest behind me to stay silent and still. The knocking came again, just as polite as before, and the voice repeated its request, and in that repetition, in its mechanical evenness, the falseness showed through completely. Then the voice went quiet. For several long moments there was silence on the other side of the door. Nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant steady hum of the lamp above. And then that silence gave way to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Businesslike, unhurried, purposeful. They'd stopped pretending. They were going to work on the door. I stepped back from it, and in that moment something shifted inside me. The fear didn't leave. It stayed, a block of ice lodged beneath my ribs. But something else joined it now, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. This was my home, my tower, my light. For 41 years I'd kept my watch here, buried other men's dead, and never once given ground to the sea. And now these people had come in the night to take from me both the secret and my life, as though I were not a man at all, but just another piece of wreckage in their path. I decided then that they wouldn't take me easily. I turned to my guest. There was no more time for games or mutual suspicion, not for the next few hours at any rate. We had a common enemy now, and whether I liked it or not, my only chance of survival was alongside him. I told him plainly, "They're breaking in, and if they get through, we are both dead men. So listen to me and do what I say, because I'm the only one who knows this tower." He looked at me in the half-dark, and for the first time there was neither calculation nor superiority in his eyes. Only the understanding that an old lighthouse keeper was now his sole support. He nodded. I led him away from the lower door and up into the tower. My tower had been built in an age when lighthouses like this were raised not only to cast light, but to hold against those who preyed on stricken ships, the wreckers who worked these waters in the old brutal years. Its walls were of extraordinary thickness. The lower door was oak, iron-banded, and I threw the heavy interior bolt behind us, the kind no battering ram could drive from outside. The windows of the lower level were as narrow as arrow slits. No man could squeeze through them. The spiral staircase leading upward was so tight that only one person could climb it at a time, and whoever stood higher had every advantage over whoever was coming up. I knew every step, every turn, and could run it in the dark without breaking stride, while a stranger would have broken both legs trying. We climbed to the middle level, to the room with those same narrow windows, and I looked out through one of them. In the grey pre-dawn murk, I made them out, dark figures below, at the door. I counted 3, but I sensed there was a 4th somewhere in the shadows. They were working at the door calmly and with skill, and I understood I had little time before they changed their approach and began looking for another way in, through the upper windows, up the outer wall, some other route. I had no intention of waiting while they chose their method of killing us. If this was war, then I needed to start it while the advantages of darkness and knowledge of the tower were still on my side. I took out what I'd prepared in advance, earlier that day, not quite believing even then that I'd actually need it. A keeper on an isolated rock always keeps supplies for the worst case. The things you use to signal distress when everything else has failed. Signal flares. Combustible mixture for lighting wet wood. A heavy whaling harpoon that had come down to me from the previous keeper and hung on the wall untouched for the whole of my service. I didn't want to shed blood. In 41 years, I hadn't raised my hand against any living creature larger than a fish. But these people had come to take my life, and the law of the sea, that hard law I'd learned here at the edge of everything, spoke plainly. Those who want to survive do what they must. What happened next I'll carry with me to the end of my days, and not all of those memories are ones I choose to keep. They found their way in after all. They fitted some kind of tool to the lower window, the wider one, and began forcing the opening, breaking out the old stone. When the first of them squeezed through into the cramped lower level where we were waiting, the advantage was no longer his. In that narrow stone trap, in a darkness I knew and he didn't, all his skill at killing counted for very little. I won't describe in detail how we beat back that first assault. I'll say only that the tower helped us. Its tightness, its darkness, its traps of uneven steps and low lintels that the strangers cracked themselves against as they rushed upward. I'll say that my guest, whoever he'd been before, fought with desperate skill, every movement betraying the same training his neat, even scars had always suggested. And I'll say that on that night, for the first time in 41 years, blood was spilled on the stone floor of my tower, some of it theirs and some of it ours. Because the fight cost us. When the grey dawn finally crept through the arrow slits and the attackers fell back, carrying their own and leaving us stunned, exhausted, but alive, I saw that my guest was wounded, not mortally, but badly. A blade had caught him in the side, and he sat slumped against the cold wall, pressing the wound with his hand, blood seeping between his fingers. I was battered and cut myself, my ribs burning like fire, but I was on my feet. We'd survived the night. We'd beaten back the first assault. But I knew, and he knew, that they would come again, knowing now there was no easy prey here, knowing our strength, ready to go about it differently next time. I was dressing his wound in the grey morning light, tearing an old clean cloth into strips, and he was looking up at me with a strange, long gaze. And then, as though paying a debt for the fact that I'd just fought for his life, he finally told me the truth about what was in the box. He said it wasn't simply evidence of someone's crime. It was a register, a list of names and deeds capable of destroying not one powerful man, but many. Enough to unravel an entire network that had spread its threads across half the world. That was why they'd sent not thieves, but killers. That was why the people outside would sooner die to the last man than leave without the box. And that was why, he added quietly, looking away, no one who had seen that box and knew of it could be allowed to remain alive. That was their law, and it had no exceptions. He was speaking of the enemy. But as I dressed his wound, feeling beneath my fingers the warm, living body I just saved for the second time, I watched his averted eyes and understood what he was leaving unsaid. That same law was his law too. He lived by it. He came from the same world as the man on the black ship. Perhaps, at some point, he'd even been one of them. And when the enemy was defeated, when the box was safe, there would remain for him only one small piece of unfinished business, one surplus witness. An old lighthouse keeper who'd pulled him from the sea, seen his face, held his secret in his hands, and now knew far too much. I'd saved this man twice, and I knew as surely as I knew the sunrise at my back that if I wasn't careful, it would be he, and not the man from the black ship, who would be the one to kill me. In the daylight, while the enemy had pulled back to lick their wounds and my guest had drifted into a restless sleep by the stove, I found what finally opened my eyes completely to the man I'd saved. I was going through his things, the wet clothing that had been drying since the day I'd pulled him out, looking for clean rags for bandaging, and beneath the lining of his jacket, in a hidden pocket sewn so skillfully that I only found it by touch, I discovered a weapon. Small, flat, lethal. The kind of thing a person conceals not for defense, but for killing at close range, without warning, someone who isn't expecting it. I held that cold object in my palm and understood that it had been on him the entire time. On the first night, when I had rubbed him down with a towel and tucked blankets around him. On the second day, when I had fed him and given him water. During the fight, when we'd stood shoulder to shoulder. He could have used it at any moment. And if he hadn't, it was only because I was more useful to him alive than dead. For now. I didn't take the weapon. I put it back in the same hidden pocket, sewed the lining closed as it had been, with my old but still nimble fingers. Let him think his secret was intact. Knowing that he had it and where he kept it was worth more than the weapon itself. I chose the shadows again. Chose again to seem blind in order to see more clearly. But that discovery changed something in me. Before it, I'd still been clinging to the thought that perhaps my guest really was an unfortunate fugitive, a witness to someone else's evil whom fate had cast onto my rock. The cold, flat thing in my hands killed that thought for good. A man who sews an instrument of quiet killing into his lining, preparing for it calmly in advance, the way other men sew away money for a rainy day. That man was no victim. He was a predator, temporarily caught in a trap, and the trap was my rock. When he woke, I sat down across from him and said I wanted to know everything. Not the half-truths he'd been feeding me, but everything. Because, I told him, how was I supposed to understand what we were up against? How were either of us supposed to survive if I didn't know what I'd been pulled into? And perhaps because he was wounded and weak, or perhaps because he figured he wasn't going to let me off this rock alive anyway and could therefore afford to be candid, he told me. This time, I could feel it without lying, or nearly without it. He hadn't been an innocent bystander. He'd been part of the very world that had sent killers after him. For long years, he'd served those powerful men he'd spoken of. He'd been one of the people who kept their secrets, did their dirty work, made inconvenient people disappear. He knew how it was done because he'd done it himself. And then, he didn't say why, and I wouldn't have believed him if he had, he'd decided to turn the weapon against his masters. He'd assembled that register, that list of names and crimes now sitting in a locked box at the bottom of my cove, because I'd moved the box that same night without telling him where. He'd assembled it to keep his former masters on a leash, to trade their secrets, to secure himself a comfortable life and his own safety. It wasn't a fight for the truth. It was a deal that had gone wrong. His masters had decided that a dead servant was more reliable than a living man selling their secrets. And they'd sent after him the very kind of men he himself had so recently been. And the vessel he'd been sailing on hadn't gone down by accident. He admitted it, staring into the fire. There had been other people on board, a crew, passengers who happened to be there. When it became clear the vessel was being overtaken, when they understood there was no outrunning it, he'd done what he did best. He'd made sure that in the chaos of the wreck and the storm, only he survived, with the box and the key. The others had been, to him, nothing more than a circumstance, an obstacle, a weight to be shed so he could stay afloat. Those dead whom I was certain the sea would wash onto my rocks in the coming days, they were on his conscience no less than on the conscience of his pursuers. I listened, and I felt something heavy and cold rising inside me. Because in his story, in this man who had sacrificed everyone around him to save his own skin, I recognized my deepest nightmare. my own unhealed past turned inside out. Once, in another life, I too had failed to save the people beside me. But I'd failed through weakness, through slowness, through a cruel convergence of circumstances, and for that unwilling guilt I'd punished myself for 41 years on this rock. Whereas he had done the same thing deliberately, calculatedly, and slept soundly. We were two sides of the same coin. I had given my whole life to atoning for deaths I was only half responsible for, and he sowed death around him and knew neither guilt nor remorse. And now fate had brought us together in one tower at the edge of the world and forced us to fight for the same life. I understood something else that day, and it was the bitterest thing of all. This man could not be allowed to leave with the box. Not because I wanted the secret for myself. I had no use for it. I'd have been glad never to have laid eyes on it. But because a man capable of scuttling a vessel full of people to save himself would do it again and again wherever he went. The list of names in his hands wasn't a weapon of truth against evil. It was a weapon of one evil against another. And whoever ended up with it, the world would be no cleaner for it. I began to think that perhaps the best outcome for everyone wouldn't be a victory for either side, but the disappearance of the box itself, permanently, on the bottom, where it belonged. But I kept those thoughts to myself. Outside, enemies were still waiting, and without my guest, without his ability to fight, I had no chance of surviving them. And he, in turn, was finished without me and my tower. We were bound together, two mortal enemies who needed each other precisely until the moment the outside threat was gone. And at that moment, each of us was preparing to kill the other. I dressed his wound, cooked him soup, shared my bread and my water with him, and all the while I felt the cold of that flat weapon sewn into his jacket lining at my back. And he, I'm certain, felt something similar as he watched me move around the house, wondering what weapon the old keeper had hidden away and when he'd use it. Toward evening, looking out through the arrow slit, I saw that something had changed outside. The enemies had stopped trying to work their way to the door. They'd pulled back, but they hadn't left. The black vessel still set out by the reefs. They'd spread across the rock, taking up positions around the tower, cutting off the path to the cove, to my boat, to the water cistern, to the fuel shed. They weren't storming us anymore. They were drawing a ring around us. And when I understood their new plan, it frightened me more deeply than the night battle had, more than anything in that fight. They had no intention of throwing themselves at solid walls and narrow stairways where we'd been beating them back. They were simply going to wait, cutting us off from everything needed to stay alive, until hunger and thirst and darkness did the work for them. They decided to starve us out. And in that siege, I realized, my sturdy tower was turning from a refuge into a stone coffin. On the third night, the lighthouse went dark, and that was more terrifying than any assault, because for the first time in 41 years, my light had gone out not by the will of a storm or a mechanical failure, but by deliberate human malice. The enemies had reached the fuel shed, the one that stood apart near the path, where I didn't dare show my face in daylight under the sights of their positions. And they'd poured out or burned every drop of my kerosene, the entire supply that would have lasted for months. I understood this when the lamp above flickered and died, and the tower was swallowed for the first time in my memory by a complete, eyeless darkness. I stood in the lantern room in the dark, beside the dead and cooling lamp, and felt something going out inside me along with its light. Without its light, the lighthouse was just a pile of stone, and I, without the lighthouse, was just an old man they'd locked in to die. And in that darkness, I understood the full logic of what they'd done. A darkened lighthouse meant that no passing vessel catching sight of a black dead tower would suspect anything was wrong, a malfunction perhaps, or a lighthouse long since abandoned. no one would come. No one would be alarmed. They'd cut us off not only from fuel, they'd cut us off from the last hope of a chance rescuer. The sea that had always separated me from people now separated me from any help at all. My radio had been dead since the night my guest cut its wire, so I couldn't call for help, and no chance rescuer would come to a dark tower. The ring had closed on every side. The isolation I'd sought all my life, which I'd taken for my penance and my peace, had turned against me. I was alone with death, if you didn't count the man beside me, who was himself half death. After that, they set about methodically strangling us, taking away one by one everything a living person needs. The rainwater cistern stood open against the outer wall, and one morning when I drew from it, I sensed something wrong. The water had a sharp, foreign smell. They'd poisoned it. Not enough to kill outright, no. They were too clever for that. Dead, we were useless to them, while the box was still out of their hands. But enough to make drinking it dangerous. Enough to torment us with thirst while we stood over a full cistern. I had only a small reserve inside, in a few flasks and a small cask, and I understood that from now on every mouthful would have to be counted. That was how the siege began. One I wouldn't have wished on an enemy. There were two of us in a dark tower, one of us wounded, and all around us in the darkness, those who wanted us dead were waiting patiently. I divided the remaining water into tiny portions and hid it so my guest wouldn't know where the full supply was. I didn't trust him even in this. I was afraid that in desperation he'd drink it all or try to use the water as leverage against me. We ate our food cold and sparingly. I built fires rarely and briefly, afraid the smoke would give away our position, and grudging the last of the firewood besides. We sat in darkness and cold, counting the hours, and that darkness pressed on the mind the way deep water presses on a body. Hunger gnaws at the flesh, but thirst gnaws at the soul. And worse than hunger and thirst was what that darkness and that uncertainty were doing to us. We never truly slept, only drifted off for an hour or two at a time, taking turns, because neither of us trusted the other enough to surrender fully to sleep. The sleeplessness clouded our minds. In the darkness we began to see movement, hear rustlings, sense another person's breathing. More than once one of us jolted awake at a sound that wasn't there. The mistrust between us, already sharp, was white hot by the time that siege was done with us. In the rare flickers of our meager fire, I'd catch him watching me, the kind of look that measures, calculates, waits for the right moment. And I knew he caught the same look on me. On what I believe was the fifth day, I'd lost count by then, time moved differently in that darkness, my guest broke. Thirst, his wound, fear, and the unrelenting dark had done their work and worn his self-control down to nothing. In the middle of the night, I came to with him moving through the house, and I understood at once what he was after. Water. And beyond that, the boat, or rather, the way to it. He was weighing whether it might be better to abandon everything, make a run for the cove under cover of darkness, and go alone, leaving me behind for the enemy to find, buying himself time with my life. I stepped into his path. We stood facing each other in the dark, two exhausted, starving animals, and I told him plainly, the path to the cove was covered. It was in their line of fire. He wouldn't make 10 steps, and if he ran, he'd be leaving me to die. And I wouldn't allow it. He came at me. Whether he meant to take the water or force out of me where I'd hidden the oars, or whether it was simply the desperation of a man who lashes out at whoever is nearest, I couldn't say. We grappled in the dark, and it was a vicious, silent, brutal fight, but not a lethal one, because at the last moment I think we both recognized how pointless it was. If either of us had killed the other right then and there, we'd only have made things easier for the ones outside. Alone, neither of us would survive. We both knew it, and that knowledge pulled our hands back from the edge. We broke apart, breathing hard, and sat for a long time in the darkness on opposite sides of the room, nursing fresh bruises and listening to our own heartbeats. And in that darkness, once I'd caught my breath, I spoke. I said there was no sense tearing at each other while the ring outside drew tighter. That they'd starve us out sooner or later. The water was nearly gone, our strength was fading, and time was working for them, not for us. That waiting and holding on meant losing slowly and certainly. The only chance, I told him, wasn't to wait for them to come to us, but to make them come when and where we were ready for them. To stop being besieged prey and become the hunter instead. To use the one thing we still had that they didn't, my tower, which I knew down to the last stone, and to turn the very darkness that had been our enemy into a weapon. He listened without a word, and in the dark I could feel something shift in him. Not despair coming back to life, but that cold, calculating quality that was his true nature. "What's the plan?" he asked at last. And I told him what I'd been turning over in my mind through all those sleepless, dark days. The plan was bold and frightening, and the odds weren't good, but we had nothing else. I told him I was going to light the beacon again. He decided the thirst had driven me out of my mind. Lighting the beacon meant telling the enemy we were still alive and still fighting. It meant pointing them straight at us, like moths drawn to a flame. But that was exactly the point, and I explained it to him. The light would draw them out. When they saw the beacon suddenly come to life, they'd conclude our nerve had broken, that we were signaling in a panic, calling for help, advertising our desperation. They'd rush the tower to put out that signal before anyone could see it, rush it quickly, carelessly, losing their patience. And they'd be walking not into a tower where cornered prey was hiding, but into a trap we'd prepared for them. The tower would become a snare, the darkness our ally, and the light the bait. My guest was quiet for a long time in the dark. Then I heard him laugh, not a cheerful laugh, but a cold one, admiring and dangerous at once. "Old man," he said, "you're more dangerous than you look." And in those words, strange as it seems, there was more truth about the two of us than in anything he'd said before. We shook hands in the darkness, allies for one night, enemies forever, and began setting the trap in which one side was going to die. I lit the beacon not as a cry for rescue, but as a hook baited with light, and the moment the first beam cut through the darkness above the rock, everything down below in the black began to stir. The fish were moving toward the light, not knowing it was leading them straight into the jaws. I had almost no fuel left. The enemy had destroyed the entire supply in the outbuilding, but they didn't know about the small emergency canister that a keeper, out of long habit, always stores separately inside the tower itself, against the worst. And there was still the oil from the household lamps and whatever else combustible the house had to offer. It wouldn't last long. But I didn't need it to last long. I only needed them to see the tower come alive and believe we'd broken. And they believed it. I watched from the upper loophole as the dark figures that had waited so patiently in their ring for so many days suddenly began to move, pulling back from their positions toward the tower, pressing toward the door. They decided we were at the edge, that we were calling for help, and they were afraid someone would see that call answered. The patience that had been their greatest weapon in the siege deserted them in a single minute, just as I'd counted on. They came on at a rush, crowding one another, and they were walking into a tower that my guest and I had spent the last several hours turning into a deadly labyrinth. I knew my tower the way I knew nothing else in the world. Every step of the spiral staircase, every turn, every low lintel that would crack the skull of a stranger running upward in the dark. Every hatch, every alcove, every door that bolted from the inside and wouldn't give from without. And all of that knowledge I'd poured into our trap. On the lower steps and the darkest stretches, we'd strung nearly invisible lines across the passage. The kind a man running in pursuit catches with his foot and goes down hard, into the dark, onto stone. The narrow passages where two people couldn't pass abreast, we'd arranged so that an enemy could be met one-on-one, his numbers counting for nothing. The signal flares meant for distress calls became weapons in the tight stone shaft of the stairwell, blinding, burning, sowing panic. And up above, in the lamp room, the mechanism roared and turned, and its noise swallowed footsteps, confused the enemy's hearing, kept them from knowing where the next blow would come from. I won't describe that night in detail. Not because I don't remember it. I remember it too well. Every moment of it is seared into me. But because there are things a man shouldn't recount at length if he wants to keep what little peace remains in his soul. I'll say only that the trap worked, that the darkness and the confinement, the roar of the lamp and the blinding fire of the flares, and my knowledge of every stone did what they were meant to do. The enemy entered the tower one and two at a time in the narrowness of the staircase, and whatever advantage their numbers and training gave them melted away inside those walls the way a wolf's advantage melts when it's driven into a badger's den. They tripped on our lines, cracked their heads on the low arches, lost each other in the dark, and we hit them where they were weakest, then fell back higher and met the next one. The tower helped us. That old mass of stone seemed to come alive and turn against those who'd come to defile it with violence. My guest fought savagely. In that struggle, everything from his former life, all of his dark trait, came out of him without remainder. And I saw him for what he truly was, not a fugitive, not a witness, but a predator in his natural element. He moved through the darkness and the tight spaces with a terrible, honed precision, and where I only defended and set traps, he killed. I watched him in the flicker of the fire and understood that a man capable of this would never leave a witness alive. That my worst suspicions about him had been right, and more than right. But my plan wasn't perfect, and I'd known that from the start. I'd known it had a weak point, and the weak point was my ally himself. And when the fighting reached its peak, when the last of the attackers had been brought down or had fled back into the darkness toward their black vessel, my guest did what I'd been prepared for, and it cut me to the quick all the same. He betrayed me. Convinced that his enemies were beaten and that he had no further use for me, he turned against me. At the very moment I was least able to defend myself, worn down by the fighting, wounded, empty-handed. He didn't even come at me directly. He lunged past me, downward, toward the cove where the boat was hidden, calculating, I suppose, that he'd managed to learn where I'd stashed the box, that he could grab it and go, leaving me behind, alive or dead, for whatever survivors were still outside. And that was when, in that darkness, everything became utterly confused, friend and enemy, light and shadow, all of it indistinguishable. The survivors outside saw someone running and rushed to cut him off. My guest found himself caught between them and me, between the hammer and the anvil, and in the blind chaos of that final struggle, it was impossible to tell whose side anyone was on, who was hitting whom or why. It wasn't a war between two sides. It was a senseless three-way brawl where every man fought for himself alone. I remember the roar of the lamp overhead. I remember blinding flashes. I remember hands and voices and shouting. I remember fighting blind for my own life, unable to make out any faces. And then something happened that I hadn't planned for and had no power over. Either a fallen flare ignited what remained of the fuel we'd laid for the trap, or someone in the melee knocked over the lamp with its last measure of oil. But the base of the tower suddenly filled with heat and a tremendous roar, and part of the old masonry, already weakened by the window we'd torn out and by the siege, came crashing inward with a sound like the end of the world. I was thrown, buried, pinned under something heavy and dark. The last thing I remember from that night is a deafening crash, and then a silence equally deafening. Absolute, total, containing no lamp roar, no shouting, no sea, nothing. The darkness swallowed everything, and I didn't know whether anyone had survived in that darkness besides the darkness itself. I came to among the rubble in the grey morning light, not understanding at first whether I was alive or not, and the first thing I grasped as my mind cleared was that of everyone who had fought in my tower that night. Only two of us remained on the rock, he and I. I pulled myself out from under the debris that had pinned me, but by some miracle hadn't crushed me. The old beams had collapsed into a lean-to above my head and taken the weight of the fallen masonry on themselves. My whole body was one continuous pain, but I was alive. I crawled out into the light, into the ruined lower room, choked with stone, and looked around. The attackers were gone. Not one of the men who had come for us from the black vessel remained. The trap, the fighting, and the collapse had accounted for all of them, and their bodies lay under the stone or had been carried off by those who'd retreated. I never counted them and had no desire to. The black vessel itself, as I saw later when I made it outside, had vanished from the horizon. Either the survivors had fled after losing too many men, or I had killed or captured every last one of them, and the ship had been left without a crew and carried off by the tide. I don't know. I know only that the threat from the sea, the one that had menaced us from outside, ended that night. And a few paces away from me, also pulling himself out of the rubble, also battered and bloodied but alive, my guest was getting to his feet. We looked at each other across the wrecked room in the grey morning light. Two survivors amid general destruction, and that look held everything at once. The memory of fighting side by side, the memory of his betrayal the night before, and a clear, cold understanding that now, with our enemies dead, there was nothing left between us to prevent us from becoming enemies to each other. The siege was over. There was no common adversary, no need for one another. There were only two of us, one box and one boat between us, and one of us was one too many. But he didn't come at me, and I didn't come at him. We were both too exhausted, too badly hurt, and perhaps we both understood that after everything that had happened, settling it by brute force here among these ruins would have been too crude and too squalid. Instead, we did something we hadn't done in all those terrible days. We sat down among the wreckage of my ruined tower, facing each other, and spoke honestly. It was our last game, but this time we played it with all our cards on the table. He made me an offer again, but differently now, without the old polish, without the promises of wealth. He said tiredly that we had both survived where we should have died, that it had to mean something, that we'd earned our lives, each of us his own. He proposed that we leave together, share the secret, share the box, share the new life that the list of names could buy for both of us. He said I'd saved him 3 times and that he had no wish to repay me with death, that he was tired of killing, that perhaps with me, somewhere new, far from the sea, he might manage to become someone different. He spoke beautifully, as only he could, and perhaps in that moment he even believed his own words. And I felt the temptation. I won't pretend otherwise. I was old, I was wounded. I had spent 41 years in voluntary confinement on a bare rock, atoning for another man's death. And here was someone offering me a way out, to leave this place wealthy, to begin a new chapter at the end of a life, to see at last the world I'd abandoned an eternity ago. Part of me reached toward it, the way a man half frozen reaches toward a fire. I could have said yes. I could have taken that last gift the sea was offering. But I looked at this man and saw everything I knew about him. I saw the ship he'd sunk and the people he'd sacrificed to save his own skin. I saw the flat blade sewn into his lining. I saw how he'd betrayed me the night before, at the very moment he no longer needed me. And I understood that he would betray me again the moment I became unnecessary to him once more. A man who lives by the rule of leaving no witnesses doesn't change because of fine words spoken at dawn. And I understood something else, the most important thing of all. That list, that box, it wasn't freedom and it wasn't justice. It was a plague, a contagion he wanted to carry off my rock and back into the world. Wherever that box went, new killers would follow, new ships would be sunk, new bodies would wash up on someone's shore. For 41 years I had kept the light burning that saved people from death in these waters. I couldn't now use my own hands to release something into the world that brought death with it. I thought about myself as well, about what I would become if I accepted his offer. I had spent my life punishing myself for the one time I had failed to save someone. To take this man's hand, to take his bloody secret, to leave with him, that would mean betraying everything I had lived for, becoming half of what he was. I had chosen this rock once so as not to be among those who take lives. It would have been foolish, at the very edge of my days, to trade that for a warm home bought with someone else's blood. And so I told him no. I told him I wouldn't go with him, and I wouldn't give him the box. I said it quietly, without anger, because there was no anger in me, only a tired clarity. I told him he was free to take the boat and leave on his own if he wished, to go right now, and to go light, but without the box, because the box would stay here, with me, on this rock. I told him I wouldn't let that contagion out into the world, whatever it cost me. He looked at me for a long time, and I watched his face change. First came disbelief, as though he couldn't understand how a man could refuse such a thing. Then anger, because I was destroying his last plan. And then something I hadn't expected to see on a face like his, something that resembled the shadow of understanding. The shadow of that very humanity which, by his own account, he had long since buried in himself. Perhaps for one moment, looking at a stubborn old man prepared to die rather than let evil loose in the world, he glimpsed the road he himself had once chosen not to take. Perhaps I only imagined it. But in that moment, between the two of us, two broken men among the ruins at the edge of the earth, something real passed between us. And I understood that the end was near, that I had made my choice, and that I wouldn't step back from it, whatever came next. Many days later, a cutter finally reached my rock, and the men who came ashore found an old lighthouse keeper alive and composed amid his half-ruined tower, with no guest, no box, no trace whatsoever of the deadly game that had been played out here. Only rubble that could easily be put down to the recent storm. I'm setting this down now, much later, on the clean pages of my old log, alongside the sparse entries about the weather and passing ships, because somewhere there ought to be a record of what happened here. Not for any human court of judgment, I told them nothing. For some other higher reckoning, before which I'll soon have to answer. When the cutter's crew asked what had happened to the tower, I told them a great storm had brought down an old wall and nearly buried me beneath it. That was almost the truth. I told them the kerosene had burned up in that same storm, which was why the light had gone out, and that the radio had failed. They believed an old man, and why wouldn't they? Who would suspect a siege, murders, a deadly game on a solitary rock where a keeper no one needs has lived quietly for 41 years? They helped me repair what was most essential, left supplies, promised to send men to rebuild the tower, and left. And I was alone again, just as I had always wanted. You'll want to know what became of the visitor and the box. I'll tell you, because that's the very reason I'm writing this. The visitor left. On that grey morning, after our last conversation among the ruins, when I told him no, we sat in silence for a long time. Then he stood up. I was certain he was about to throw himself at me, that he'd remember the flat weapon sewn into his lining, that the law he'd lived by would overcome that shadow of humanity I'd glimpsed in his eyes. I prepared myself for death, and, I'll say it plainly, I was hardly afraid. I was old, I had lived my life, and dying without having released that evil into the world seemed to me a worthy end. But he didn't throw himself at me. He stood over me, looking down with that long, unreadable gaze of his, and then he did something I never expected. He turned and walked away, toward the cove, toward the boat, alone, without the box. I want to believe, that in that moment the old stubborn keeper, ready to die so that evil would stay buried, showed him a road he himself might once have taken and hadn't. And that he couldn't bring himself to kill that road along with me. The sea, however, had its own judgment. My boat was the only one, and in it he went out into open water at dawn, wounded, exhausted, spent. By midday the wind had risen again, not as terrible as that first storm, but enough for a man who could barely stand in a frail little boat on these graveyard waters that had claimed thousands of sturdier vessels. I watched him from the wreckage of my tower until he disappeared behind a curtain of rain. He never came back, and no body resembling his was ever washed up on my rocks afterward, and I watched and waited. Perhaps he made it out after all, got away and lives somewhere, still under a new name. Or perhaps the sea that once gave him to me finally took back what it had brought. I don't know, and I'll admit I don't want to know. The box remained, that locked metal box with its list of names and crimes, that contagion that had brought ruin to everyone it came near. I didn't open it. Not then, not afterward. I even had the key, the very thing the visitor had been clutching in his fist on that first night, which he dropped among the ruins in the final struggle. I found it later in the dust and rubble. I could have opened the box and learned the secret that had cost so many lives, but I didn't. What does an old man at the edge of the earth need with someone else's dark secrets? That knowledge was poison, and I had no wish to take it into my soul on the threshold of death. One quiet night, when the sea was smooth and still, I took the box and the key, went out in the boat they'd sent to replace the one that was lost, and rowed out beyond the reefs to a place where I knew the depth was black and bottomless, where even these graveyard waters ceased to be a graveyard and became simply a fathomless abyss. And there, under the stars, with not a single witness, I lowered the box over the side. I watched it sink into the black water, giving one last dull gleam as it went, spiraling down deeper and deeper, carrying with it the names, the crimes, someone's power, someone's vengeance, someone's wealth. All that human corruption that people had been willing to multiply with deaths for the sake of possessing it. I threw the key in after it, in the opposite direction. Let the secret stay there, on the bottom, forever. Let the sea, which all my life had brought me nothing but wreckage and the dead, serve something good for once, and bury in its depths what had better never return to the word of man. You'll ask why I didn't leave. I could have. After everything, I could have asked for a place on that cutter, left the ruined tower behind, and lived out my years among people, in warmth, in safety. No one would have held me, an old keeper who had more than served his time. But I stayed, and here is why. In those terrible days, I understood that my solitude on this rock had never been only a punishment, as I had believed for 41 years. It had also been a duty, a true duty. I thought I had been hiding from the world by coming here, but in fact, I had been standing between the world and what threatens it from the darkness, just as my light stood between the ships and the reefs. On that terrible night, I understood that I was needed, that there are things someone must keep far from people, at the very edge where they can't be reached. A secret on the floor of the sea, a light in the night. The stillness of these graveyard waters. I stayed because I finally found meaning in what I had previously seen only as punishment. Not flight from guilt, but redemption through service. The difference is small in words, but it is everything. I repaired my tower as best I could. I lit the light again. And it burns to this day, every night, turning steadily, casting its beam into the darkness, keeping other lives from destruction on the reefs. I'm old, and I won't be standing at this lamp much longer, but while I'm alive, the light won't go out. And now, writing these final lines, I understand at last why I took them up. Not to justify myself, not to boast, but so that whoever reads this one day, perhaps the new keeper who comes to this rock after me, will know the truth. Will know that beneath these quiet waters, in the black abyss by the reefs, a secret lies sleeping that is better left undisturbed. And will know the most important thing, the thing I understood too late and paid too dearly to learn. The sea gives back only what it no longer needs. But sometimes, very rarely, a man is given the chance to return to the sea what is no longer needed by man. And in that one exchange, the old keeper of a solitary lighthouse found himself at last not a debtor, but a man who had settled his account in full.